Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation on insect population declines, their causes, and what can be done. My name is Laura, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few housekeeping rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras are off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those some point during or after the presentation. We will have a very brief survey following the presentation that should take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Tonight, we welcome Ted Burk, Creighton professor of biology, whose main focus is on insect conservation. Thank you for being here, Ted. I'll let you start the presentation.
That's good. Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who came out on a nice night, either in person or online. So again, the talk is going to be about insect population declines, their causes, and what can be done. Oops. Okay, how do I advance it? Okay, good. So you sometimes, have probably heard about the 5 great mass extinctions in the history of animal life on Earth. The most recent and famous is the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, 66 million years ago. And there have been 5 of those historically. And so some people are beginning to say that maybe we're in the midst of a 6th mass extinction. Mass extinctions are usually defined as at least half of all species on Earth go extinct in a short period of time. And so there's some disagreement, but some people think that we are at the point where we really are going to be close to that, if not there by, say, the end of the century. Aldo Leopold, of course, is one of kind of the founders of the environmental movement in the country. He said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that you live in a world of wounds. You kind of see all the hurts that are around you. These are 3 of the famous species that have gone extinct, of course, passenger pigeons and Carolina parakeets. And then the one in the middle is the Xerces blue. It's the first species of butterfly to go extinct in the United States. And the Xerces, Society for Invertebrate Conservation took the name Xerces from the Xerces blue. So we'll start with some depressing facts here. According to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, 28% of all species on Earth are threatened with extinction. 25% of all mammals are threatened with extinction. 76 have gone extinct in the last 500 years. 200 vertebrates in total have gone extinct just in the last century, and this is approximately 100 times the natural extinction rate. Tigers have been eliminated from 95% of the original range, lions from 94%, cheetahs from 92%. There are actually more tigers living in captivity now than there are in the wild. The human biomass, the weight of all humans, is 9 times the weight of all wild mammals. And the biomass of livestock, cattle and so on, is 14 times that of the biomass of all wild animals. 60% of all mammals on Earth are livestock, and another 36% are humans. So of all the mammals on Earth, only 4% are wild animals. Similarly, for birds, 70% of all birds on Earth are poultry, chickens and turkey and things. I always this is not on the board, when I teach my conservation class, the first time I said, obviously a lot of this is just a result of just the sheer number of people. So I looked up how many was the human population in 1952 when I was born. It was 2.7 billion, and now it's 8.2 billion. So the number of people on Earth has tripled in my lifetime, and obviously it's having these kinds of impacts. In North America, before humans, the average weight of a wild mammal was 90 kilograms, about 250 pounds. The average weight of a wild mammal in the United States now is, I think that's something like 8 kilograms, 20 pounds. Yeah, there you go. I don't know if there's probably no way to put that it's not, probably where it was is probably as good as anything. Anyway, some people are kind of pessimistic. They say that it may be true that before long, the largest mammal on Earth will be that. Anyway, you might think, well, insects are kind of abundant and they reproduce quickly and so forth, so maybe they're not subject to some of these trends. But in fact, the news for insect populations is just as bad, if not worse. 39% of the butterfly species of England have gone extinct in the last 2 centuries. Honeybee colonies have declined by about 50% since the 1940s. A survey in Illinois where they went back and looked, repeated survey that had been done a century earlier, found that half of the 109 native bee species that were present then are not there now. In the Midwest, half of the bumblebee species have declined, and 4 of them have been extirpated, which means not extinct globally, but no longer found in this particular region. Of course, we all have heard about the declines in monarch butterflies. So this shows you the number occupying the roost down in Mexico over winter. And this is the equivalent data for the much smaller numbers that went to roost in California in the winter. And so there's so many of them that they can't possibly count them. So what they do is they count the number in a certain area and then they extrapolate. So what they actually do is they measure the area of the forest. It's an Oyamel fir forest, 10,000 feet up in the mountains, south and west of Mexico City. So you just measure the area on the ground where the trees are all orange instead of green. And it's an amazingly small area when you think about it. But anyway, but it's 25 million per hectare, which translates to like 10 million per acre. And so every year what you get as a report is just how much ground in the forest was covered with monarchs. And you can see going back 30 years, that was 18 hectares. So that would be, 45 acres. And there were about, 500 million. If you go back to the year after that severe drought that we had in 2012, it was 2/3 of a hectare. And so that means there were less than 20 million as opposed to the 500 million before. 2 years ago was the second worst year. They've come back a little bit since then, but even this kind of, what we had was kind of an old normal, and now we've got a new normal, which is only a half or a third of the old normal. And even that, that's 3 hectares, so that's 7.5 acres. And so that translates to something like 70 million butterflies. So even that is like 85% down from what sometimes used to happen. And the situation in California is like far worse. So again, there were never nearly as many. Instead of talking about tens or hundreds of millions, it was hundreds of thousands or a few million. But again, if you go back 30 years, there were over 1 million that would spend their winter in a number of smaller roosts along the coast in California. This year, there were 6,000. So it's a reduction of 99.5% from 30 years ago. Yeah, this is unfortunately. I wish the Xerces Society knew that this is not because people aren't looking. This is the number of places that they checked. So they're working hard to find them, but the green bars are how many butterflies there were. So there's a very real risk that the migration of the western monarchs from the Rockies west is probably going to be gone. Whereas obviously there are threats to the ones that go to Mexico. All the ones from the Rockies to the Atlantic and from the Gulf to southern Canada are all the ones that go to Mexico. And it's worth emphasizing, we're talking all the monarchs that are from the Gulf to Canada and from the Rockies to the Atlantic, they ended up crammed into one small area of 7 acres. It's an incredible density, but they're also incredibly vulnerable because of that concentration. There was a study done by kind of a group of German entomologists that had an entomology club, and they set up these traps and caught flying insects in them. And they've been doing this for a long time, as you can see. And they found that the biomass, the total weight of flying insects, had decreased by 77%, over that period of time. There were studies in the Puerto Rican rainforest where they went back and repeated a study that had been done in the 70s. And they found that the total weight of insects in that protected rainforest was down by 97%. And of course, this has, ramifications. There are things that eat insects. So the animals, the insect-eating lizards had declined by 2 times. Frogs declined significantly. And of 9 insect-eating birds, 8 of them declined, and at least in one case, 90% fewer than had been found there before. So it's not just the insects, but the things that depend on insects that are also affected. So going back to 2018, the situation became so apparently dire that the New York Times started calling this the insect apocalypse, and ran a big feature story. And that's kind of been the term that's often used for this. So Laura thought that the apocalypse name was kind of a little bit too apocalyptic, for this talk. But but anyway, that's often the framework of the discussion. Now sometimes it's called the windshield effect. As some of the old people like us remember that when you drove down a road, especially at night, you have all the bugs hitting the windshield. But that hardly ever happens anymore. So that reflects the declining number of insects. There's a group in England that runs something called the British Big Bug Count. So they actually gave people these splatometers. So it's kind of a transparent board with stickum on it. So as you drove along, you kind of hit things. And they were only getting one bug hitting them every 5 miles. So this is just, one kind of, somewhat lighthearted sort of way of kind of characterizing this decline. There was a recent review that looked at a lot of different papers that have been published. And they said, as a consequence, they concluded that 41% of insect species are in decline. About 1/3 are threatened with extinction. And of course, lots of species have lots of little local populations. To wipe out a whole species, you have to wipe out each of those little populations. And so for at the individual population level, insect populations turn out to be going extinct in local settings at 8 times the rate of vertebrates. And overall, the insect biomass is declining by 2.5% per year, which doesn't sound that much, but when you start carrying that over a decade or 2 decades or whatever, then you're losing half of what was there. And it's like all great disasters, there are multiple causes. A lot of things have to go wrong to give you that big a result. So they kind of divided up the different causes into this pie chart. So, intensive agriculture, converting kind of natural habitats to agricultural purposes was a big one. Here we've got pesticides. Then we've got other things like, deforestation, urbanization, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different things that are contributing to this and different things to different species. But in fact, there are other things even that aren't even taken into account on that one. One thing that people are giving a lot of attention to now is what they call artificial light at night, ALAN. And so this is what, from space, the United States looks like at night. How many of you, again, I'm talking to the wrong group here. How many of you have ever seen the Milky Way? Yeah. So again, when I ask my Creighton students are usually, from cities in the Midwest. I'll have a class of 30 or 40 students, and I'll ask how many of you have ever seen the Milky Way? Not a single one has ever seen the Milky Way because of the light pollution. You have to get out in the sandhills or somewhere away from all the lights. That's, one of the most prominent objects in the night sky. But if you have all this artificial light, most people have never seen it anyway. So again, this is something that didn't show up on that guy's chart, but part of it is that we go out and count things in the daytime. We don't kind of go out and do the same kind of studies at night. So we're probably missing a lot of what's happening at night, and especially a lot of the pollination probably is done by moths at night. And we have virtually no information on that at all because people just don't go out and study pollination at 1 o'clock in the morning. But it does things like disrupts orientation. Things will use the moon to guide them when they're trying to escape from a predator or something, and instead they circle a street light. Interferes with foraging, including pollination. It disrupts mating and it increases predation. Bats are really smart, and bats learn very quickly that a lot of bugs congregate under streetlights, and so they can kind of clean up there. And the bad news keeps coming in. I'm going to get away from the here at some point, but anyway, so these are just some more recent studies. Leaf beetles, which are one of the very largest families of beetles, declined in Germany by 70% in 10 years. British moths, 2/3 in 50 years. Grassland insects in Germany by 34% in 10 years. Forest insect species in Germany by 36% in 10 years. And the biomass of mayflies is down by over 50% from the Mississippi River and from Lake Erie. You used to get these enormous mayfly emergences. There'd be so many of them that would just pile up on the streets, and it was actually dangerous to drive because you hit your brakes, you just skid on the insect juice. But those kind of things don't really happen much anymore. And in fact, That's important because mayflies in their juvenile forms are really, really important in the food chain for feeding fish. And the adults are very important for things like swallows, aerial predators. So again, there are ramifying effects. When the insects aren't there, it's not just the insects that suffer, it's things like fish and birds. In the so-called undisturbed Oconee National Forest in Georgia in the last 15 years, the number of bee species declined by 39%. The bee populations, total numbers of individuals, declined by 62%, and butterflies by 58%. A study recently was done looking at the effects of climate change and intensive agriculture worldwide, and it said that there had been a 50% decline in insect abundance, total numbers, and a 27% decline in the number of insect species in intensively agricultural areas. One study showed that in 70 locations in the western U.S., where climate change impacts are generally more severe, butterfly populations have declined over the past 40 years by 1.6% per year. But again, you take 1.6% and then you take care of that over 40 years, you're talking about substantial declines. Moss in Great Britain declined by 44%. And then here's another study. They had 450 species that have been closely monitored for some period of time. And over 40 years, they've declined by 45%. These are butterflies and moths in particular, but these are all the other insects and invertebrates there. So bad news. People care about monarchs, so just a brief description. Why are monarchs suffering? Well, one thing is habitat loss. So again, there's conversion of natural habitats to agriculture. There's urbanization. There's road building and things like that. But actually, the biggest factor here is the adoption in the last 25 years by farmers of genetically engineered herbicide-resistant crops. So you get Roundup Ready soybeans, Roundup Ready corn. And it turns out that a lot of the milkweed that monarchs were growing up on was milkweed that was growing on or around the edge of a cornfield or a soybean field. And it was like super good milkweed because it was irrigated and it was fertilized. And, you got like 4 times the return in terms of number of monarchs raised from a milkweed in a cornfield than you did in a kind of a nice virgin tall grass prairie. So we've lost an area, total area equivalent in size to the state of Texas. And not only is the total area, but that was the area where, there were disproportionately more monarchs being produced. So that's number 1 on the list. It's not been quantified very well, but certainly these neonicotinoid pesticides have probably been a big problem too. They've looked at that more with bees, and it kills them, but also if at sublethal levels, it disorients them so they can't return to the nest and things like that. The corn that you plant the seeds is genetically engineered to be, resistant to that herbicide, but they also coat the corn seed with neonicotinoid insecticides so that things like rootworms won't sort of kill the little seedling as it's growing. And this is all of these things are products that are the product of Bayer. Roundup was developed by Monsanto, but about 10 years ago, Bayer bought Monsanto. It was at the time the largest merger in the history of the world. And so basically Bayer is controlling all this stuff. And it's very difficult for a farmer to get anything other than the neonicotinoid coated seeds that are of the herbicide resistant, crops. That's pretty much all they can get. And so that's been a big problem. Illegal logging, the roost down in Mexico, half of it has been eliminated and what's left is fragmented in little pieces. So the monarchs are much more likely to be exposed on the outside where they're more vulnerable to cold and rain and things like that, as if they were in the middle of a nice intact forest. And shortage of fall flowers. Again, we mentioned earlier when we're talking here before the talk that monarchs depend on fall flowers to actually get them to Mexico and make them through the winter. So, with things like droughts in Texas, there's just no sunflowers. And so, fewer fall flowers in general. Extreme weather, of course, we've had droughts, we've had fires in California, droughts in California, and all these things affect monarchs too. And then monarchs have pathogens. This is a monarch that's been infected with a protozoan parasite, and the spores, accumulate on the milkweed leaves. And it's typical and it's normal for something 10% or more of the monarchs to get infected, and then they're deformed and obviously can't function. But that's an increasingly serious problem. One thing that's exacerbating that is a lot of people in the South are replacing kind of or they're supplementing the native milkweeds with tropical milkweeds like Mexican milkweed. Now up here, we grow it as an annual. It won't survive the winter, and so that's fine. But in the South, it'll actually survive over winter. So all the way from California to the Atlantic, it'll survive over winter. So there's green milkweed available all winter. And so some of the monarchs, when they're migrating, if there's milkweed, they'll actually stop and reproduce and won't complete the migration. But what's worse is our milkweeds all die back to the ground in the winter, and so it resets the clock in terms of the spores on the milkweeds. But if you have milkweed, which is there constantly, the spores just build up and build up and build up, and the rates of parasitism get very much higher because of that year-round milkweed from the tropical. So it's fine to get tropical milkweed and plant it here because it's not going to survive the winter. But if you're down in Louisiana or California, whatever, you do not want to be using tropical milkweed. Anyway, that was a digression. Again, it's like I said before, there's a lot of different things that contribute to the loss. But the biggest one by far in the last 30 years has been that conversion in American agriculture, and that's not going to reverse itself. We've lost the cornfields forever, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, so the conclusion is, from all this doom and gloom, that we know enough to take action. The Entomological Society of America issued a statement saying, collectively, these studies should serve as a call to action. The Xerces Society, which if you don't belong to the Xerces Society and you care about this thing, you certainly ought to join it. They are by far the best organization working for invertebrate conservation, and they're also by far the best organization working for pollinator conservation in particular. They do a lot of other things too. They do fireflies and butterflies and bumblebees and all kinds of stuff, freshwater mollusks and all kinds of things. But for $35 a year or whatever, it's really an organization worth belonging to. We have local people here. I don't know if you've ever gotten any of the Xerces people for a talk, but Jennifer Hopwood would be a good person to get. Anyway, so who cares? Fewer bugs, the better, right? But no, that's not right. Insects are actually the dominant group of animals on Earth and have been for over 300 million years. They comprise over half of all known species on Earth. There are an estimated 6 million different kinds of insects. And if you add up the total, who knows, but the estimates is that there are a billion individual insects on Earth, 10 to the 18th. Weigh them up and their total biomass is 6 times that of people. Of course, there are a lot of people, and their ecological and economic impacts are tremendous. This is a graph from the entomology textbook that I've used, and so it shows the number of species of different kind of groups of organisms are represented by the size of the example that they have here. So this little puny thing here is all the mammals, this kind of little elk there, and that fly represents the 6 million species of 5,000 kinds of mammals and 6 million kinds of insects. So sometimes they impact us directly in an economic sense. Honey from honeybees is worth $300 million a year. We also get beeswax, bees bread, bee brood, propolis, and royal jelly. But the big thing is pollination. Honeybees worldwide pollinate over 200 crops. Just in the US, it's worth $20 billion a year, and worldwide, it's over $200 billion a year. But also native bees also pollinate some of those crops. Again, people ship honeybees all around the country to pollinate almonds and apples and things like that. But the native bees also chip in. So the pollination of crops by native bees is thought to be worth about $3 billion per year. And of course, we get other things from insects too: silk, shellac from the lac insect, red dye from an insect that feeds on cactuses. It's gotten really popular lately because they use that red dye a lot in kind of the drinks that you get from Starbucks and stuff. So anyway, and of course we use them for biological control of other pests. So a famous example was where the scale insect was threatening agriculture in California, and they brought in ladybugs to eat the scale insects. And then we actually use some plant attacking insects to try to control things like invasive thistles. So this is one that lays an egg in the flower bud, and then the maggot grows up inside, but it prevents that thistle from then flowering and producing seed. So that's a strategy that's being used. Have to be careful though. A biologist at the University of Nebraska found that these guys also attack our native thistles as well as the aliens. So sometimes they're not as specific as you'd like them to be. The main thing though is insects provide these things called ecosystem services. It's been estimated, it's hard to put a number on this kind of thing, but all the things they do for us environmentally, somebody said, well, we'll try to put a figure to it. It's worth $57 billion a year in the United States. So what are the kinds of things we're talking about? Well, food for other animals, birds and fish and so on. Regulation of plant populations. They keep, plant populations under control. They clean up the environment of dead things and animal waste. They are, in fact, the best control of each other. Predators and parasites are the main, population controls of other insects. And of course, there's always so much, discussion about pollination. So a little bit more about some of these. So again, food for birds and food for fish. 60% of birds rely on insects for food. And in fact, it's more than that because even things like hummingbirds that don't feed much on insects as adults, they feed their chicks on insects. And same thing with a lot of the seed-eating species of birds. So that's 60% that rely only on insects throughout the life. But the other 40%, many of them feed insects to their young. So they're the most important food for birds. And so insect-eating birds are declining at a higher rate than other kinds of birds. And especially high rates of decline are grassland species like here in the Midwest. That's the group of birds that as a group are declining the fastest. And of course, fish. It's one of those mayflies that did come out. What a lot of people don't realize, again, I'm an entomologist, so I always kind of boosting up, what insects do. The caterpillars of moths and butterflies, mainly moths, consume more of the Earth's vegetation than any other group of animals, including large mammal grazers. They are the dominant herbivores on Earth. So they, will control plant populations. And in fact, what can happen is if you have a plant which is kind of competitively dominant, it can eliminate other plants from that area. So by insects keeping it down, they promote biodiversity in general by allowing the other ones to survive that competition. So this is a tomato hornworm, which you may have seen on your tomato vines. But anyway, they're incredible eating machines. A monarch caterpillar in the summer, when it hatches from the egg, it goes through 5 stages of molting before it goes into the pupa. And, they're cold-blooded, so the warmer it is, the faster things work. So it could complete that whole process of going from egg to pupa in 10 days. And in that period, they will increase their weight by a factor of 3,000. So if you've seen pictures of caterpillars eating, it looks like it's been sped up. That's just the natural rate at which they eat things. To try to kind of make this more vivid, I said, okay, let's try to relate this to the size of a human baby. If a human baby increased in 2 weeks by a factor of 3,000, what's an animal out there that would be that big? And it's a killer whale.
Yeah.
So they grow in 10 days, equivalent to a human baby growing to the size of a killer whale. So they eat a lot of stuff.
Huh.
Now, as the old song says, you don't know what you've got till it's gone, right? Well, sometimes things get out of whack, and it really shows you what was going on normally, when things got out of whack and part of the system was missing. So prickly pear cactuses got introduced into Australia, and without all their natural enemies and competitors, they just went crazy. You had whole areas of Australia that were nothing but a solid, thick mass of prickly pear cactuses. You don't get that in the Americas where prickly pear cactuses are native. And so what they did was they went to South America and they brought in a caterpillar, a moth. It has this wonderful name of Cactoblastus. It's kind of like a Roadrunner cartoon, the cactoblasting caterpillar. And in no time at all, they cleared it up. And so now you get, a few cactuses get into some place, takes a while for the caterpillars to find them and kind of hopscotch around, the Australian, landscape. But this is what has been going on for, forever, in the Americas. We don't realize the impact that those guys are having because we don't see what would happen if they weren't having that impact. On the other hand, again, I mentioned the fact that some of those thistle controlling flies can be a problem. Kind of turns out Cactoblastus can be a problem too. It's inadvertently gotten introduced it's from South America, and it's got accidentally introduced into the southern US and into some of the Caribbean islands where it's devastating our native cactuses. You gotta be careful about the biological control. Make sure it only gets what you want it to get. Of course, as the cleanup crew, again, just think about all the dead carcasses and all the animal poop that would pile up if we didn't have things like blowflies, if we didn't have, beetles like our endangered species, the American burying beetle. If we didn't have dung beetles, it's been estimated that the cleanup service that dung beetles provide to ranchers would be worth $380 million a year. There's another one of those examples from Australia. If you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Australia, the native animals were things like kangaroos that make little dry hard pellets, and that's what the Australian dung beetles had evolved to handle. So we bring in millions and millions of cows, and they do this instead of that, and the Australian dung beetles can't handle that. So it's an ongoing problem. There's 29 million cattle in Australia, and they produce 340 million dung pats a day, about 12 per cow, so 12 of those per day per cow. They cover up to 1 million hectares of grazing land. They pollute the water, and they are breeding grounds for millions of flies. One particular thing called the buffalo fly, they spend $170 million a year to control the flies that breed in cow pats. And so what they had to do, what they are doing and continue to do, is they've brought in dung beetles from Africa and Europe that are used to dealing with this kind of stuff and kind of mitigated the problem. But before they did that, I mean, literally, just as some areas before were covered with, cactus, I mean, there were areas where the whole pasture was knee deep in cow poop. Of course, again, insects, one of the main ecosystems is controlling other insects. So we have predators like dragonflies, damselflies, praying mantises, and, all the other things on the list there. They are the major, population controllers of other insects, but in particular, one group of insects are the biggest population controllers of other insects, and these are things called parasitoids. So they kind of, in some sense, are kind of somewhere in between, like a true predator and a true parasite. They consume their victims from inside like a parasite would, but they kill it like a predator would, and so they're most wasps are that. Most wasps aren't the big things that live in colonies that we see. There are hundreds of thousands of little wasps that are solitary, and they are parasitoids of other insects. So if you had anybody had those tomato hornworms on their tomatoes, you ever see one that came out and was covered like little silken cocoons? That's a parasitoid wasp that gets those hornworms. And very, very frequently, you'll see one that it's been hollowed out inside, and they come out and pupate, and it looks like little ant cocoons or something, but the whole horn will be covered with those pupae from the parasite that got it. There's a few flies and some others, but anyway, altogether, hundreds of thousands of insects that make a living by being parasitoids of other insects. And so here's just one example. A guy once pointed out that if you have just the flowering plants, of which there are 300,000, and the plant-eating insects, of which there are 500,000 or 600,000 that we know of, and the parasitoids that attack them, like this tachinid fly that hits monarchs that eat milkweed, that's that simple three-step food chain: a flowering plant, an insect that eats the plant, and a parasitoid that parasitizes that insect. That's half of all species on Earth. Of course, we all know about pollinators. 88% of flowering plants are pollinated by animals as opposed to being wind pollinated. And of those, more than 80%, probably more like 90%. But anyway, most of those are pollinated by insects as opposed to bats or hummingbirds or whatever. So altogether, there are more than 200,000 species of plants that can't reproduce without insects. And of course, we think of honeybees, but of course, they're not native here. They were spread all around the world by Europeans. But they are the main pollinators of our crops. But there are 4,000 native bee species in the United States, and we probably have 400 or so here in Nebraska. And so they are what evolved to pollinate our actual natural native flowers. There are a lot of flowers that honeybees can't actually pollinate. I mean, for example, there's one group of flowers that are pollinated, what's called buzz pollination. The pollinator has to shake the male part of the flower to get the pollen to be released, and honeybees can't do that. Tomatoes are one example of a crop like that. So things like bumblebees or sweat bees, are the ones that can do that. That buzz pollination are necessary. But it's not just bees; they're the most important. But flies, lots of flies, butterflies and moths, lots of wasps. lots of beetles, etc. So here's just a few. We want, go just kind of show you them for the visual impact. So here's just some of our native bees, of which again we have hundreds here in Nebraska: bumblebees and longhorn bees and leafcutter bees and so forth. You're going to your garden, you see those nice little circular holes in your rose leaves or some of the other things. Those are leafcutter bees. They cut those up, they line their nests with them. Flies, mainly the hover flies, but some other flies as well. And the larvae are important predators on other insects like aphids and things. And they're good for predators on other insects as maggots, and then they're pollinators as adults. Butterflies, we have 200 species of more than 200 species of butterflies in Nebraska, and they undoubtedly do some pollination. And then we have 15,000 species of moths in Nebraska. I'm sorry, 1,500. No, I was right first at 15,000. Anyway, and so some of them are important pollinators. And of course, the other thing, of course, insects have tremendous scientific value. Maybe I was right the first time. I can't remember. It's either 1,500, probably 1,500 they're known.
Yeah, 15,000 nationally, I think.
Yeah, that's probably right. 1,500 here, and that's way underestimate. But anyway, there's 10 times as many moths as there are butterflies in general. Anyway, but much of what we know about genetics and about how animal embryos develop comes from studies of Drosophila. A lot of what we know about animal social behavior comes from ants and honeybees. So they're very valuable scientific models. But quite apart from all of these kind of economic things, they're really cool. They're beautiful. They're fascinating. They inspire us and they provide aesthetic satisfaction. E.O. Wilson, the recently deceased ant specialist, he came up with the idea that something called biophilia is part of our nature, to be kind of a well-balanced kind of fully fulfilled human being. We have to commune with nature. It's just kind of necessary to have a healthy, well-balanced person. And this is especially a problem with kids, getting kids exposed to nature and forming that connection. He compares it to, if you're losing a species of insect, you're losing a unique thing that evolved and will never come back. It's like losing a great work of art, a unique creation that won't be able to come back. And every one of the 6 million species has its own fascinating tale to tell. Okay, so is it hopeless? When you Google insect apocalypse, you'd be amazed at the kind of things that come up on your Google search. Anyway, that one seemed appropriate. Cockroaches probably will survive the apocalypse. But anyway, it's not completely hopeless. There's lots of things you can do. So for example, be active at the local level, join local organizations to support their efforts, things like Conservation Nebraska or Nebraska Monarchs. Nebraska Monarchs has a big native plant giveaway, in the middle of May every year. So watch out for that and get some free, native plants for your garden. Support national and international organizations like the Xerces Society that I mentioned earlier. The main monarch organization is Monarch Watch down at the University of Kansas. They are the people that one of the things you can do as a citizen science activity is monarch tagging, in the fall when they're migrating. That's all coordinated by the people down at KU. Be political, be an active advocate with local governmental agencies. Talk about things like mosquito spraying and roadside mowing and weed ordinances and things like that. Work with schools and youth groups, educational programs, help them have their own pollinator gardens, things like that. Get educated and encourage your community members, talk to your neighbors about what you're doing and why. And show them some of the cool stuff that shows up as a result, and they might even come around. And then get involved in citizen science projects. Just we need so much information about so many different things that there's no possible way that PhD scientists could do anything, like even a small fraction of getting the information we need. So there are hundreds of citizen science projects where you can get involved and help contribute kind of that big database that we need to develop. And of course, at your own kind of level, have an insect-friendly garden, in your own yard. Here's just some examples of citizen science activities. So North American Butterfly Association does 4th of July butterfly counts every year, kind of patterned after the Audubon Society's Christmas bird counts. We do one in Omaha every year. We do one in Lincoln every year. They're usually within a week or two, either way, of July 4th. So if you want more information about that, just email me at Creighton and I can help you get hooked up with the Omaha or Lincoln ones. Another example, kind of the Game and Parks people, along with some other organizations like Xerces, they do a program called Bumblebee Atlas. So you sign up, to do surveys in your own particular area on kind of a somewhat regular basis, to identify what bumblebees are there and how many and so forth. And that's been really valuable in increasing our knowledge about, our local bumblebee species. And there's hundreds of others. And again, monarch tagging, I mentioned, is something a lot of people do. Anybody can do. You just buy the tags at cost from KU, as many as you want to get. They all have a unique combination of letters and numbers. You stick them on the wing of the butterfly and let it go. And then this year, just this one last year, they've now come up with solar powered radio transmitters that are small enough you can stick them onto the back of a monarch. And so there's a big network of aerials all over, the world called MODIS, which have been used. They've been doing this for birds for a long time. If the thing flies within, a few hundred yards of one of these aerials, then it gets automatically recorded and entered into the computer database. We've got a local person here who's installed dozens of those at various nature centers and places in our area. But now they've got it down small enough that you can get it on a monarch butterfly. So we're able to do now what we never could do before, which is to track an individual from day to day. And so it's really cool if you go to something like Monarch Watch now, or just kind of, Google generally kind of that monarch tracking program. Every day they give a report. Well, here's, this, they tagged something like 1,000 of them last year. And so they tracked them going down to Mexico, and now they're tracking them coming back. And they actually have a cell phone app for that because it uses Bluetooth technology. So if you download the app and you have Bluetooth on your phone, if it gets within 100 yards or so, you can pick it up. Of course, the odds are fairly small with millions of them coming back and 1,000 of them with a transmitter. But it is really cool to see how this guy, went from here to there. And some of them have been quite impressive. I mean, we used to think that the farthest they go is like maybe 100 miles in a day. But there was one this year that made 300 miles in one day. It must have caught a really nice south wind. Kind of sailed up from Mexico into Texas in no time. Main thing, again, is kind of what you can do in your own yard. So create an insect-friendly garden, number of aspects here. I like to say mow less, but mow less in 3 different ways. Mow less area, convert some of that grass, which is just a sterile, monoculture that has basically no environmental, use at all, advantage at all. Convert some of it into habitat, and so mow less, but also mow less often. There was a study that was recently published that said about every 2 weeks is optimal for wildlife. Too often you get this, and you let go too far, then some of the, the plants kind of tend to dominate the others and so forth. But every couple of weeks kind of tends to keep the vegetation diverse and the insects happy. And don't mow as close to the ground. Don't scalp it off like a golf course. Set your mower on the highest setting when you mow. Again, so you can turn something like this, and there are a number of different organizations that will certify your lawn, National Wildlife Federation, Xerces, Monarch Watch, etc. Again, you can put these up, and hopefully your neighbors will appreciate what you're doing, and then your neighbors' teenagers won't vandalize them. Anyway. So second thing, nectar plants. Again, for the bees and the butterflies and so forth, you need to have nectar plants for the adults to feed on. It's really important to have something flowering all through the period from spring to fall. Don't just have a bunch of stuff that's out in July and nothing before or after. You need to provide for different species are out at different times. Most of them don't live very long. And so, you'll have different ones out there in June than you have in August in terms of individuals. So try to have continuous blooming. They're attracted if it's more of a kind of a big block, which is all the same color. So that helps. And then they're sun lovers. I tell people that, some of you, again, are old enough to remember the old vaudeville song about mad dogs and Englishmen come out in the midday sun. So I always say, well, it's mad dogs, Englishmen, and butterflies come out in the midday sun. And go native. Doug Tallamy, the University of Delaware, has written a number of books about the greatly increased importance of using native plants as opposed to cultivated horticultural varieties. Those are basically useless in terms of ecology, whereas native plants are very, very important in supporting wildlife. So for example, here's just one of the books that I recommend, I'll show it at the end here, is called Bringing Nature Home. So for example, a lot of people have Monarda in their yard, bee balm, and it's great, and it's beautiful, and it does attract hummingbirds and so forth. But we have a native Monarda called wild bergamot, which to me is just as attractive. And it's one of our absolute top nectar plants. So why get this from the from the nursery when you can have that instead. Anyway, so go native if you can. It contributes so much more to wildlife than these cultivated varieties do. Here's some of the plants out of at the prairie that the butterflies love and the other pollinators. So thistle we mentioned, and sunflowers, truth sunflowers and false sunflowers, goldenrods, ironweeds, bergamot. I mean, there's a long list of things that they like. Again, bees and flies and beetles and things, not just butterflies and moths. Here's some annuals. It's okay to have some annuals in your yard, even though they're maybe not native. Petunias, zinnias, verbenas, native and exotic, and marigolds are all attracted to pollinators. Other habitat elements, it's not just flowers, but flowers feed what's there, but it's not going to grow things that aren't there. So you need the other things that they need to grow. So for butterflies, you need host plants. You need the caterpillar plants, in your yard, so that the females will lay eggs on, the caterpillars will grow and turn into butterflies. And so there's a number of things: milkweed, the carrot family for swallowtails, violets, legumes, even nettles are a host plant for one of our migrating butterflies. For bees, what you need are nest sites, and 70% of our bees nest in the ground. So a little bare ground in your garden is a good thing, because that's where the bees, bumblebees and sweat bees and things will build their nests. Other bees use standing wood, either perennial stems or woody brush, woody stems or whatever. Again, brush piles are important for things to overwinter successfully. Things like, new bumblebee queens overwinter in brush piles and hollow trees and things, and then come out to start a new colony in the spring, which they're doing now. You could even put in a beach. I've had mixed, some people say these work really well and other people say they don't work at all. So, try it and see what happens. You do have to clean them out because they will build up bacteria. So if you're going to do that, you have to, clean them out with bleach every year. So whether you like it or not, I mean, that's just another alternative for some of the things. But obviously, he's saying that, I know you say they don't really work for there. The one thing that doesn't work for butterflies are these things they sell that they call butterfly houses. And butterflies never go into those. So don't get a butterfly house unless you like wasps or spiders, which really love them. But on the other hand, why wouldn't you want wasps and spiders? Anyway, but not butterflies. Water source, again, for bees and butterflies and things. Sunny spots for basking, they're sun lovers. And fruit, if you're putting out orange slices for your orioles, the insects will like those too. There are some butterflies that prefer fruit, to nectar from flowers. Again, so here's just examples here for the milkweeds that you could get here. Common milkweed, which comes up on its own everywhere. The butterfly weed that you get so often at nurseries. Swamp milkweed is actually the favorite for them to lay eggs on. And then on the prairies, you get this thing, world milkweed. So those are just 4 of our natives that all are good caterpillar plants. But most of them grow up on this just because there's more of that than anything else. But if they have a choice, they like the swamp milkweed the best. Some of the host plants are weeds. Like I said, stinging nettle for red admirals. The clovers are caterpillar plants for sulfurs. Plantain is the caterpillar plant for buckeyes. Thistles are a caterpillar plant for painted ladies, and so on and so forth. So some of the stuff that we kind of think of as weeds actually turn out to be, important caterpillar plants. There's some grasses. There's a group of butterflies called the grass skippers. And these are 2 really common ones that you'll see in the late fall or late summer and fall. And their caterpillars feed on grasses like big bluestem. This is from Ptolemy's book, Bringing Nature Home. So these are just a bunch of the different perennial flowers, but this is kind of show you that trees can be really important too, especially for moth caterpillars. And so this shows you for, all the different species of oaks, and this is just in his part of the country, the Northeast, but it holds for us too. There are over 500 kinds of moth caterpillars that feed on oak leaves. And then, black cherry is good, willow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, trees, can be really important, especially for moth caterpillars. But some trees are too. Now in our part of the world, again, trees are more for moths than they are for butterflies. But we do have some butterflies that use trees as their caterpillar plant. And in our part of the world, I don't think it was even on his list there for moths, but for our part of the world, the best tree for butterfly caterpillars is hackberries. As you can see, we've got 5 different species of butterflies whose caterpillars eat the leaves of hackberries. So like, here's the hackberry emperor butterfly, and there's a hackberry. But again, things like black cherries is that different species tend to have their own particular plant that they lay the eggs on for the caterpillars. And so you can easily find out this information. But here's just some of the trees around here that butterflies use as caterpillar plants and some of the butterflies that use them. Again, you don't have to have a brush pile that big, but it's like, back in the corner of the yard, if you have some branches that you have pruned off or whatever, pile them up, let the leaves build up, and things like bumblebee queens can make it through the winter. Obviously, go easy on chemicals. There have been studies that show that people spray chemicals in their yards at 3 times the rate that farmers spray their crops. And so go easy. And again, when you treat for one thing, you're often wiping out lots of other things too. So a lot of people spray their yards for white grubs. But when you do that, you kill all the other ground living insects, the ground nesting bees, the fireflies, ground beetles, etc. So they're going to kill everything, not just the white grubs. When you go and buy flowers from the big box stores, they're often pre-treated with pesticides because they say, well, people don't want to buy something that's nice and beautiful and take it home, and then 2 days later it's full of holes. Right? So they will so often, at least historically, they've always sprayed them with pesticides. So anything that comes and visits that flower gets poisoned. So try to make sure that the things you buy at nurseries and big box stores haven't been pre-treated with pesticides. And there are some places like Lowe's where they say they have that policy, but they don't. They actually are pesticide treated things, even though they say as a policy we don't. So you gotta be careful. Those are, herbicides and pesticides that people, frequently use. For pest control, the best thing are other insects, like we said, predators and parasites. So again, if you have, the most natural, diverse kind of, vegetation in your yard, you'll have the most diverse and useful set of beneficial insects like these guys. And they will, in most cases, at least not eliminate, pests, but at least keep them down to manageable levels. And finally, cultivate tolerance. Put up with some weeds. Dandelions and white clover turn out to be very favorite nectar plants. At the beginning of the year, like now, and at the end of the summer, when not much of anything else is flowering, they go to the dandelions. And white clover is by far the favorite nectar plant of the little eastern-tailed blue butterflies. You got clover in your yard, you're going to have these little blues on it. Okay. And of course, some of them are caterpillar plants, plantain, violets, nettles, they're all caterpillar plants. So don't be a clean freak. Let the perennial stems, stand there over winter because bees will build nests. Some of them build nests in the dead stems. Dead wood, same thing, brush piles we mentioned. So again, having a little bit, of a messy yard, at least in the back where nobody sees it, is important for wildlife. Again, put up with wasps and spiders where you can. Again, sometimes you things like hornets, you got no choice. But in general, if they're not where they're going to be frequently interacting with people, try to leave them alone because they are by far the best predators we have on insect pests. And again, if you're careful around them, and careful with the kids and so forth, you can usually put up with them. You don't have to get rid of them just because they're there. Then you probably have to comply with city ordinances. Like I said, I've got written up by the weed ordinance officer in Omaha 12. But you can change those. A lot of cities around the country are changing their weed ordinances to allow you to, have native plants and milkweeds and things like that. And it will be worth it because you will just see so many more interesting things in your yard every day that you'll get a lot of pleasure and feedback from, being a little bit tolerant of things. Here's just a few things. Messy habits that help wildlife. Leave the leaves. Leave the seed heads standing in the winter. Don't pull all the weeds. Don't mow too low. Go easy on mosquito spraying. I love this Wizard of Id cartoon. There's a wasp in the house. Wizard, get rid of it. And he says, look away. You don't want to see this. And then he sort of sneaks out and releases and says, here you go, buddy. The world needs you too. Because again, all those paper wasps and things are actually, wasps raise their young on the flesh of other insects. One group of wasps kind of went rogue and became the bees. One definition of a bee, it's a hairy vegetarian wasp. But wasps feed their young on, the flesh of other insects. Want to protect monarchs, for example, again, plant milkweed, have nectar flowers, support organizations like Xerces that help protect the overwintering sites in Mexico and California. reduce pesticide use, get involved in things like, the July 4th counts and monarch tagging, and so forth. But the thing is that like monarchs are really good because everybody loves monarchs. They don't do any really harm. They don't really do much benefit either, but they're just beautiful and fascinating. There's nothing else that has that kind of migration of any animal in the world. But the thing is that what you do for monarchs helps other things, right? We think of milkweeds for monarch caterpillars, but milkweeds are also one of the most attractive milkweed flowers are one of the most attractive nectar plants for all kinds of things. And similarly, so again, this is what's called an umbrella species. Other things kind of benefit, under their cover. What you do for a monarch will benefit a lot of other things, like those beneficials and other pollinators and things. Anyway. In general, just live an ecologically sustainable life. I like this quote from the philosopher's statement. Edmund Burke, this is all the way back to the 1700s. But he said, sometimes problems are so big that you think the little pittance that you can do just won't make any difference at all. But of course, if everybody does their little pittance, it could add up to a big outcome. So I love this quote. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. And then of course, that whole buzz phrase from the environmental movement, think globally, but act locally. This is a picture my wife took in our yard, like 2014. New England aster. In the fall, there's not much flowering except asters. Right? So asters, fall flowers are really important, and New England aster is really popular. There are in that picture 8 migrating butterflies, stop to refuel on their way south. 7 monarchs and 1 buckeye. Just that one day on that one patch of flowers. I don't get that every year, but that's the kind of thing that can happen. We got cup plant and a bunch of other stuff in there too. So this is what got me written up, was like having all these weeds.
Can see why.
Some books, again, I really recommend Doug Tallamy's books, Bringing Nature Home, and then a newer book, Nature's Best Hope. He says that if everybody just did the little things they could, the sum total of that would be like adding several national parks in terms of the area. And then Xerces Society has a tremendous amount of information, pamphlets and guides and really good books. This is a really good book that they put out on attractive native pollinators protecting North America's bees and butterflies. So there's tons of resources out there available now, and lots of people are getting involved and interested. So I hope we have time for some questions. I pretty much took the hour. But again, when somebody complains about your yard, tell them it's, again, if we can kind of move that just a little bit so they can see the catch line there. Tell them it's not a bead lot. It's not a weed lot. It's a bee lot. So. And that's the end. And again, I'd be happy to take questions wherever they might come from. Any questions?
I think there were
Some online.
a couple of them
2
there.
comments there.
What was that poster that was on? Well, I guess I don't know which poster you mean. But in most of these cases, you can just get online and Google and try to use the right search terms. And, most of my stuff I found, in that way on the internet. So, but then again, Iowa Parks Department, whatever they call it in Iowa, Department of Natural Resources, whatever, they've got a whole bunch of really cool stuff, posters of, birds and butterflies and flowering plants and the seasonality of different flowers and plants and so forth. There's a ton of stuff you can get from Department of Natural Resources in Iowa. There's just a lot of stuff out there. Where can you get that? Oh, that came off the internet. So try Googling and finding it. I should have had the URL there. I apologize. But, any states or countries to model? Well, the thing is that,
Thank you.
let's take Great Britain. I did my doctorate in Great Britain. I lived there for 5 years. My wife is English. In some ways, they are way ahead of us because, for example, they have a network of monitoring of butterflies and bees. The whole country is divided up into 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer grids. So basically, 6-mile by 6-mile grids. And in each one of those grids, there are volunteers that routinely carry out surveys of butterflies and bees. And so they have, the citizen science activity, they have a tremendously increased amount of information, and they've been doing this for decades. On the other hand, there's less of the native ecosystem existing in Europe than anywhere else probably in the world. It's all been converted to people in agriculture. So there are some countries which are really good at the kinds of things they're doing now, but historically they've been among the worst. So I don't know there's any particular country that I could kind of hold up as a paradigm. Among tropical countries, Costa Rica has traditionally been a kind of a pioneer. But again, now there's some political, changes going on in Costa Rica that are threatening some of that. So, it's an unstable world. So, I don't know that there's anyone that I particularly model. There are certainly differences from state to state. And I think in many respects, Iowa, it's more progressive in some ways than ours. If you drive along the interstates in Iowa, they've put, native plantings all along the interstates and things like that. Would it be possible to have wildflowers instead of lawn along? Yeah, well, that's a great point. Again, the Xerces Society has really been kind of pushing that. The local Xerces person, Jennifer Hopwood, she's the spouse of a UNO professor, and she's been here for 10 years and very active and doing all kinds of things. But that's actually one of her specialties is kind of roadside restoration for conservation purposes. And that's again, we lost the cornfields. We're not going to get cornfields back. So where are we going to find the habitat? And right-of-ways and roadsides are two of the largest available sources of restored habitat. Some people worry that if you put a lot of vegetation on both sides of the road, you just get a lot more roadkill, things back and forth. But there actually have been studies that show that the benefit to the populations is greater than the loss due to the roadkill. We've actually, at the reserve where I work, Glacier Creek Reserve, we've actually tried to quantify, how many things get killed crossing State Street, in and out of Glacier Creek. But anyway, so that's a great idea. Again, roadsides and right-of-ways, for railroads and utility lines and things like that. There's a vast amount of potential habitat there. What would be the ideal farm for insects that would grow food for? Well, I think organic farming. It doesn't give you the kind of the tremendously high yields, that you might get, but again, it's much more ecologically sustainable. The food's probably healthier. And again, one thing that does help, and again, there used to be at least some federal, subsidy programs and things like that, to maybe have a pollinator strip along the side of your cornfield. Or even have, kind of, natural vegetation strips kind of running through, a crop field. Because again, that will, promote especially the populations of those beneficial predators and parasites. So you won't need to do as much pesticide spraying if you have these roadsides. Obviously, you're helping pollinators with the flowers and things, but you're also creating a habitat where lots of these beneficial predators and parasitoids, will build up populations that can go into your crop. And an organization that's done really good work in this respect is Pheasants Forever. And, Pheasants Forever has fairly deep pockets because pheasant hunters, like to contribute. So they have hundreds of farm bill specialists that work with farmers to help them take advantage of these kinds of programs, which obviously benefits pheasant populations, but also has much greater benefits than that. And I went to a presentation one time by somebody from Pheasants Forever that said they actually had done a study that showed that last 5 meters of your cornfield is usually very low yield. And if out in the middle of the field, you get a good return on your investment. But that edge of the field, it produces pretty poorly. And in fact, it's a negative because you spend more on the fertilizer and the irrigation and the pesticides and so forth than you get back in terms of the yield. So you actually benefit economically as a farmer by putting in like a wildlife strip. That's actually going to give you more money than if you tried to plant, corn and beans on marginal land. That's the kind of argument that really works, with a farmer. It's like, you're not just doing this because you're a tree hugger. This is actually going to put more dollars in your pocket, if you have those kinds of things. So, will my slide set be available online? Well, what I would say, my email address is all very straightforward. It's just Ted Burk, TEDBURK, all lowercase at creighton.edu. And what I've got is a PDF that I can send you. So I don't know that we'll put it online, but anybody that wants it, if they just contact me at Creighton, then I'll send them that PDF. That, I guess, cover everybody. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious if the monarch populations outside of the US are in such dire straits as some of the ones?
Well, that's the thing. See, the monarchs as a species are not endangered because there are populations of monarchs all over. There's monarchs in the Caribbean. There's monarchs in Central America. They got taken by people to Hawaii, got taken by people to Australia. They either got there themselves, blown across in a hurricane, or somebody took them to Spain. So there's a large kind of population in Spain. They're even, in Great Britain, they blow over occasionally in storms. It actually appears on the list of British butterflies. They call it the wanderer, as opposed to monarch. But again, people are planting milkweed over there. And the climate is milder in the winter. And so, England may have a resident population. So the thing is that what's endangered is not the species. What's endangered is the one most remarkable thing, which is the migration. The only populations that do that, this sort of an incredible migration are the ones in North America. And so I don't think the other ones are much smaller overall, just in terms of sheer numbers, but I suspect, like all insects, they're kind of suffering from pesticides and things like that. But you don't hear, news of their declines the way you do of the ones here in the U.S. and Canada, Mexico. There is a trilateral commission, that was set up during the Obama administration, for cooperation between Canada, Mexico, and United States on issues like that. Guess where that's gone? Anyway, no more trilateral commission. Anyway. Some people have said there was actually a bill in Congress, didn't go anywhere, that we should have as the national insect, we should have the monarch, because it's a bold pioneer that explores new territory and it's tough and rugged and kind of cooperates with our neighbors and all this sort of stuff. Most states, if they have a state insect, it's the honeybee, which isn't even a native.
I'm sure about ticks up there.
Yeah, ticks.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, again, a lot of the sources of funding are drying up, and so. Again, anything you can do, supporting organizations like Xerces or whatever, or Conservation Nebraska are important. But again, at this point in the state of the world, political advocacy is probably, as important as anything one could do. What the purpose of ticks? Well, see, not everything in life has to have a purpose. Right? That's a very anthropocentric perspective. Right? It's either good for us or it's bad for us. And if it's not bad for us, if everything had to have been put there for us, then even things that seem to be bad for us, must actually have some deeper sort of purpose. Their only purpose is to live and survive and reproduce, right? And it's just that,
Yeah, feed the basket.
blood-bearing hosts are just a really excellent source for them. They provide a lot of food. I mean, a lot of things eat ticks. And so I don't think they're kind of at an important base of the food chain or anything, but then, ticks all die too, and a lot of them die by getting eaten by something. But again, it's a very human-centered attitude that, it only deserves to exist if it's got some use for us. And again, we have a lot to overcome in Western culture. I grew up, my grandparents homesteaded. My father grew up on a farm. He was a rural mail carrier. And his attitude was, when I drive around, on my mail route, I can tell who's a good person because their barn is freshly painted, and their area is all nice and clean and tidy. If you have a kind of a barn that's fallen to pieces and you got a bunch of weeds, you're morally inferior. You got to get over that, right? But we just have inherited this from Western culture. Our ideas about what's desirable. Are one of the big things we have to overcome. We have to change our way of viewing, the world around us and not think of it as he loved Wisconsin because, Wisconsin farms are all like that. But I mean, what you got to get, away from the attitude that, you got to have a pristine green lawn like a golf course, and you got to have a freshly painted barn and all that sort of stuff. We just have centuries of Western culture that we're fighting here. Let's see, yeah, and I don't like tick. I am a tick magnet. When I do my surveys of the prairies, I have to dose myself with DEET, and I still get them on me. But I've had hundreds and hundreds of them on me, and I think in a whole lifetime I maybe had 2 or 3 that actually got so far as to bite me. So you don't want that. They spread diseases. They're nasty things. I hate them. Right? But on the other hand, they're just kind of part of what we have to deal with. And again, climate change is probably making it worse. The ranges of some of the significant ticks are spreading. We're going to get ticks here now that we haven't had in the past. And we're going to get, more things, like Lyme disease and alpha-gal allergy, if you've heard about that meat allergy and so forth. The things that didn't used to be here that are coming in, with climate change. So it's just, part of being careful. I mean, they're working on a vaccine for Lyme disease, and that really will be a life changer if they get that developed. But of course, vaccine development is like another thing that's being taken here. But yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me. This is kind of my goal. I was what's called a Rhodes Scholar, which some of you may know about. And, Rhodes Scholars are supposed to be people who are selected because they will fight the world's fight. Although somebody said the definition of a Rhodes Scholar is someone who had a brilliant future behind them. But anyway, this is my way of getting back to people that pay for my graduate education, this is my way of fighting the world's fight, is to go and do this kind of thing. And often I'm preaching to the choir. But on the other hand, if anybody gets a new idea or two, that's I've done my little bit. Yeah, purpose equal benefit. Well, a lot of it is just what you value. Do you value everything in terms of dollars and cents, or do you value everything in terms of that biophilia, the aesthetic value, the heritage that you're leaving for your children and grandchildren? I mean, when I look at things like the passenger pigeon, it just breaks my heart that, we will never see passenger pigeons. If you go back 150 years, one of every 4 birds on Earth was a North American passenger pigeon. There were that many of them. And in 50 years, the very last one died in a zoo. And so I think of all those things that we did, and eliminated things that could have been here now, it just breaks your heart. We don't want to do that to our progeny the way that our ancestors did it to us. I guess that's the moral. Do what you can. Every little bit helps. I'm organic and a pollinator gardener. When you know better, you do better. Okay, I can't disagree with that. And we all make compromises. I eat meat when I know I really shouldn't. I drive a car to work, most days rather than taking the bus. Part of it's the bus service in Omaha is so terrible. The nearest bus stop is 3 miles from where I live. But anyway, so we all make compromises, but that kind of like that thing about, you can't do everything, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do something, and so even every little bit helps, even if we can't all live kind of a, perfect life of a saint.
I'll just say, in case anybody's tempted to buy one of those bee hotels at a store.
Oh, yeah.
They're really poorly designed. They're really not going to get
It's probably better to just get have, when you have the tree removed, leave, the first 6 feet of the trunk.
Yeah.
And get out your electric drill. And you'll probably do better than those. Yeah.
If you make a lot of holes, if you make one of those artificial structures, they do tend to attract the parasitoid wasps and the dermestid beetles and the mites and the disease and all.
Well, and like I say, you build up the bacterial spores and things like that. So if you don't maintain them, and it might work really good 1 year, and then you're poisoning everybody, the next year. So anyway, but again, natural habitat is probably almost always better than something that you buy to try to replace natural habitat. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.